Talk About It Tuesday question is inflation related to political issues, or is it something that is related to the economy and not politics? What political issues are affecting the economy and in what way? So, if you watch the cable news stations, then you will believe that a president has a strong influence on how well or how poorly the economy does. So if it's a cable station whose political ideology is leaning towards a sitting president and the economy is good, they will give him all of the credit, despite the fact that he has very, 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 very little influence on the health of the economy. And if a station is opposed to a sitting president and the economy is bad, they will put all of the blame on that sitting president, again, despite the fact that they have very little influence on the economy. So let's just get a basic economics lesson and let's see why we have inflation. So inflation, first of all, is a natural and normal recurring event in the economic cycle, and the economic cycle ebbs and flows constantly. While there's no defined period of the cycles of the economy, which is growth, peak, decline, trough, or recession, the recovery, which is growth again, hitting the peak again, and then a decline. It does this constantly, all the time. And what drives this cycle? It is simple. Supply and demand. Supply and demand cause the cycles to occur. So let's look at this. When times are good, when people have money, they want to spend money on goods and services. The amount of goods and services are in a limited supply. While they are spending, businesses seek to keep up with the demand by expanding. And how are they able to expand? Okay, so now we got to talk about this little side thing. There is something called monetary policy that is driven by the central banks. In the United States, the central bank is the U.S. Federal Reserve. Their responsibility is to control the amount of money in the market, right? So they can either increase the amount of money that's in the market or they can decrease the amount of money in the market, and to control the cost of money, meaning borrowing and credit, with the interest rate, long-term interest rate. So in good times, you'll find that there is a lot of money in the market and interest rates are low. So when interest rates are low and there's a lot of money in the market, people are buying. People are buying on credit. Businesses are borrowing in order to expand. Eventually, the means of production cannot keep up with the demand. So when the demand exceeds the supply, businesses must raise their prices so that less people will try to buy, and they're going to capitalize on this demand, by the way, right? So there's an incentive for them to keep raising the prices. So the prices will continue to rise. When prices continue to rise, then eventually people don't want to buy anymore. But the Federal Reserve then wants to cool the market. Why do they cool the market? Because as prices begin to rise and businesses can't keep up, then people stop spending. Then businesses have to contract. They have to lay people off. So you have high unemployment. You have a high cost of borrowing. It begins to bring prices down. It contracts the economy. So in order to accelerate the contraction of the economy so that you don't have a craziness happening, the Federal Reserve begins to raise interest rates on its own to cool the market. So that's what's happening now. They're raising interest rates to cool the market, to slow down spending. When you slow down spending, then prices begin to come down. So that's a natural cycle. Inflation's a natural cycle. Now, in the case we have today, that natural cycle was accelerated because of two things. One, the supply side was affected significantly. So during the height of COVID, we had a almost complete shutdown of the means of production, right? So when production shut down, supply was limited. At the same time, in order to save people, to help people, part of fiscal policy, and governments have fiscal policy, they can control the level of taxes, meaning raise or lower taxes, and decide how tax dollars are spent on government programs. And in the case of COVID, they gave out stimulus money. So there was a flood of money that went into the market. At the same time, you had supply side shortages because the means of production shut down. On top of that, the means of getting supplies to where they needed to be, logistics, also shut down. So shipping and trucking, all that shut down. So even when there was ample supply, the supply couldn't get to where it needed to be. So you had the double whammy of low supply and an inability to get goods where they needed to be, which caused massive inflation when you had people suddenly with a bunch of money to spend. So that's how we got to the inflation we're at now. So again, let's go back. Fiscal policy is what governments can do. All they can do is control taxes and how government money is spent. So they can spend it on an infrastructure program to create jobs. They can lower or raise taxes, or they can fund government programs, social programs. So if we're now in this inflationary period, and the government and people are saying, oh, we want relief, lower taxes. If they lower taxes, it will actually increase the supply of money in the system, which will keep inflation high, not reduce inflation. If they create more jobs, then it will put more money in the system and keep inflation where it's at. So the government, and this administration really has no impact on whether or not we have high inflation. They have very little impact, I should say. And fiscal policy, which is the Federal Reserve, what they're doing is raising interest rates. Now, because we're in a very unique situation, and by the way, the central banks are apolitical. They are not a government agency. They are apolitical. They are mandated to act independently, and they have a mandate of trying to keep inflation at or below 2%, unemployment at or below 4%. And they do that by manipulating the interest rates primarily and the amount of money that they put into the system. So that's why we're seeing interest rates climbing extremely rapidly in order to bring down the inflation rate. But the administration has very little impact on that. So if they can't lower taxes, and they're not going to raise taxes, which actually would help, but they're not going to raise taxes because that would be political suicide. We don't have an unemployment issue right now. So even though they passed the infrastructure bill, there's no hurry to start these infrastructure programs and create more jobs because we don't have an unemployment issue. So the problem is not political. The problem is basic economics, and it was exacerbated by the COVID crisis. So hopefully you have a better understanding. The cable news stations will point the finger, politicians will point the finger, just because it's expedient, because if you can blame somebody for the problem, then maybe maybe that person would give them their vote, or maybe their party would look better because this party just happens to be in power when the economy is bad, and vice versa. When the economy is good, different parties try to take credit for it so they can get votes. But politics has very little impact, extremely little impact on the economic cycle. The economic cycle ebbs and flows and will always ebb and flow based simply on supply and demand. So hopefully that answers your question, brings some clarity. I'd love to hear your comments. And please like, share, subscribe, keep the questions coming, and I'll see you next Tuesday.